Hey guys, and welcome to another episode of The Point. In the past few weeks, I've kind of been talking about some regrets in my life and looking into the mirror. And last week I had a great response when I had my baby girl Michelle on here and kind of explained our life story and how she was raised up by Deb and I when we were much younger, and just so proud of how she's turned out now. And what I want to talk to you about today, pretty short, pretty sweet, is the way you think. Pastor, what do you mean? Please don't tune out. Just hang with me for a second. Before I come to know Christ, I was all about Dean Herman, 110% Dean Herman. All I ever wanted to do growing up through high school was play football, chase that little cheerleader called Debbie Stallard, get a D1 scholarship with the hopes of going into the NFL. It's kind of like check, check, check. I got the little cheerleader. I got the D1 scholarship to Clemson. Was a star in Wise, Virginia as an athlete. Went to Clemson, and I was getting so much bigger and so much stronger. And I'll never forget the day that, and I'm convinced, God took football away with an injury. God took away my God because God had such a plan for me. Very bitter, very angry, mad at the world. That was a rough time for Debbie and Michelle because I was so angry with the world that they got some of the wrath. Finished school, left, and started coaching football and basketball. And a lot of you know the story that went to Green Sea and got around godly men and gave my life to Christ April 12, 1987. A lot of things in my life immediately changed because I fell head over heels in love with Jesus. But the thing that has held on to me the longest through the years was something that nobody could see. And it was my thought life. Not thought of just being like evil, sinful thoughts, but how I thought about life in itself. When you give your heart to Christ and you fall radically in love with Christ, it should change the way you think about the way you live your life because your life is no longer yours, but it's His. Let me read you a verse that just messed me up years ago, Romans 12:2. The Apostle Paul said, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect." The problem is, we don't ever really try to change the way we think. We just want to say we got saved and then move on with life. But if you got radically saved, it will change the way you look at life because you're no longer living it for yourself, you're living it for Him. And it will change the way you think, you talk, the list could go on. And something I have found out through the years of serving as a pastor, student pastor, a child of God, is how negative people are in the world today, especially Christians. We should be some of the most joyful, happy people there are because we've been changed. We look at life differently. If you remember when Paul went through the city of Philippi, he was beaten, he was thrown in prison, and later he wrote a letter to them, and this was what he said to the people in Philippi. Philippians 4:8, "Finally, brothers, whatever's true, whatever's honorable, whatever's just, whatever's pure, whatever's lovely, whatever's commendable, if there's any excellent, if there's anything worthy of praise, think about these things." Think about the incredible things of our lives, not all the negative things. And if we got just really honest with each other, the majority of us, if we wrote down all the great things of our life versus the negative things, the great things would far outweigh the negative. But all we whine about are the few negatives. When you begin to understand that your life isn't about God blessing you, but you using your life to bless God and others, it'll change the way you think. And when it changes the way you think, when you really begin to get it and you look through the lenses of life, through the correct lenses, it's amazing how all of a sudden life no longer becomes all about you, but God using you to help others. to encourage others, to give to others, to say something about Christ to others. This is my opinion. I call it the DIV, the Dean International Version Bible. And you can agree or disagree, and it's perfectly fine. But I'm convinced, especially with social media today, that the reason so many people who claim to be Christians, the reason that they've never really changed the way they think is because they're consumed with what man thinks about them more so than what God the Father thinks about them. That's why when someone makes a post, they're looking at it constantly to see what someone says, to see how many likes they got, to see what the world is saying about them. That goes against everything Christ desires us to be. Galatians 1, Paul is writing a letter to the church in Galatia, and he's writing and letting them know who he is. And when you get to this part, we see that Paul is pouring into the church in Galatia, and he's telling them, guys, what I'm telling you is the gospel. It literally is what Christ wants you to hear. And listen to how he says it, Galatians 1, verse 9. As we've said before, so now I say again, if anyone is preaching to you a gospel contrary to the one you received, let him be accursed. If they're saying anything that goes against what I was telling you, that's what Paul is saying, let him be accursed. But listen to verse 10. For am I now seeking the approval of man or of God? Or am I trying to please man? If I were still trying to please man, I would not be a servant of Christ. Did you catch that? If I'm trying to please man, I'm not a servant of Christ. If we begin to change the way we think, it will begin to come to a point in your life where you don't give a flying rip what man thinks about you anymore. You're more consumed about what God the Father thinks about you. People ask me on a regular basis, Pastor, why don't you do more on social media? Why don't you do more on X? Why don't you? It's not that any of that's wrong. It's just that I'm consumed with what Christ thinks. I just want to change this city. I want to lead more people to Christ. I want people falling radically in love with Jesus. I mean, if you hurt feelings along the way, I don't want to. But what people think about me doesn't mean as much to me as what Christ thinks about me. Why? Because I'm his. My life is his. And I'm thinking upon the things that he wants. And I'd rather have his applause than I would man's applause. So let me just finish with this. As you're making your way into the new year, start thinking about what you think about. Because you'll always be able to tell what you worship with what you spend your time on, what you spend your money on, and what you think about. And if Christ isn't at the top of what you give to, what you spend your time with, and what you're thinking about, then that's where you have to look into the mirror and ask yourself, did I ever fall radically in love with Christ? And that's the point. See you next time.